Hello, and today I'm reviewing Fritz Leiber's Swords and Deviltry, a collection first published in 1971 that takes up 3 shorts that were all available previously somewhere else. The first story, The Snow Witches, dates from 1970 and from the magazine Fantastic. It is, in today's nomenclature, an origin story for Faffrd, and Faffrd is one half of Leiber's most famous creations, Faffrd and the Grey Mouser, whose adventures have been charted and arranged in this series across 7 volumes, and that encapsulates more than 30 different shorts. With all that considered, it is probably not a big shock to discover that the second story, 1962's The Unholy Grail, is the Grey Mouser's origin, and that appeared in the same magazine. The third story, Ilmet in Lankhmar, a winner of both the Hugo and Nebula awards for Best Novella, dates from 1970 and the pages of Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine, and it details the duo's first meeting and their first adventure together. Across his career, Leiber won a number of Hugo and Nebula awards, mostly for his science fiction, and though Michael Moorcock's overly qualified the best living American writer of science fiction is echoed by Stratford, who calls him the best American writer of sword and sorcery fiction, when praise is so qualified, it's faint enough to almost be damning. All this bizarrely links Leiber with a number of writers he considers legendary monsters worshipped by fans to their detriment. A very strange concept, as public acclaim would seem to me to have very little impact on a writer's ability to actually write. And his string of Hugo and Nebula awards suggests that Leiber can write. And though Faffrd and the Grey Mouser were created with Harry Otto Fischer, it is just Leiber that's writing here. The first story, The Snow Women, begins with the line, "At Cold Corner in midwinter, the women of the Snow Clan were waging a cold war against the men," which is not the last play on words that Leiber uses in the course of the text, but I found, as a first encounter with the writer, characters and worlds, that the tone here was initially difficult to get a grip on. The machinations of the Snow Witch seem intended to be comedic. Various silent practices designed to create powerful enchantments that would tether their husbands' ankles to Cold Corner, tie up their loins, and give them snivelling, nose-dripping colds. Any man so unwise as to walk alone by day was apt to be set upon and snowballed. So comedic, in fact, that the latter protestation that this is not funny seems only to amplify that comedic effect. Certainly these passages, the general setup, the play on words in that first line, seem to me to be establishing Leiber as almost as one of Pratchett's forebears. And a snowballing by Snow Clan women was nothing to laugh at. They threw overarm, it is true, but their muscles have been greatly strengthened by much splitting of firewood, lopping of high branches, and pounding of hides, including the iron-hard one of the snowy behemoths, and they sometimes froze their snowballs. Like Pratchett, Leiber's comedy, for all its outlandish setup and bizarre execution, has that grounding in reality that helps it ring true. For example, later in the chapter, one of the Snow Wives snowballs her husband to within an inch of his life with gusto, only to then nurse him back to health in a fashion calculated to keep him from seeing the travelling show that's just arrived. Among the travelling show is Vlana, an actress who is travelling with them to escape enemies in Lankhmar before she can return and get revenge. Little does she know that the show's foreman intends to sell her into sexual slavery with Cold Corner's resident thug, Hringle. I don't recall Pratchett writing books about sex slaves, but the Discworld catalogue is too vast for me to be sure. Regardless, this comes back to what I'm saying about tone. It's not a huge difference, but consider, as an example, something like Dan Aykroyd's Dragnet versus Beverly Hills Cop. Both are similar movies, both are funny, but they're funny in different ways. And a lot of the Dragnet humour would be as out of place in Beverly Hills Cop as the more graphic violence of the latter would be in the former. And when Faffrd races to save Vlana from being murdered by the local women for the crime of going for a walk, you start to wonder if the grit and the whimsy aren't perhaps grating against each other rather than complementing each other. The Snow Witches, however, soon embraces its dark side, putting the humour on the back burner, and resolves into a fine supernatural fantasy tale. Leiber was a noted fan of H.P. Lovecraft, and that side of his writing is exceptional. Fafford's mother, Moore, is the village matriarch and the head of the coven of witches that rules the area with a Puritan zeal for cold and presumably cold showers, enforcing a strict adherence to unspecified traditions and decency. And while her magic, her influence over Faffrd on the screen for pause button fans, leaves Faffrd cold, it's her sorcery that's truly chilling, and yes, that's a god-awful pun. But you can see here why Stratford again calls him an artist who can weave spells with words. And this second passage, your father bitterly regrets his mountain paramours. He stares up endlessly from lidless sockets at the home he despised and now yearns for, so near, so impossibly far. His fingerbones scrabble feebly against the frozen earth he tries futilely to twist under its weight. Faffrd's father was a mountaineer in his spare time, hence the Mountain Paramour's passage, but the rest of this passage is very much Lovecraftian, and with such a wicked and cruel punishment so matter-of-factly related. Moore is a scary witch, so again I'll just suggest that this level of darkness perhaps seems out of place with a more light-hearted seeming opening. The story is far better when it moves away from that and embraces its devilish heart. But Leiber is, in various places, described as somewhat idiosyncratic, and it's fairly easy to see that he has quite a unique style. I think probably he has had many imitators over the years. Some copying his characterization, some his world, stories in which predate Dungeons & Dragons by some 30 years. His style, though not always what you'd call correct or even that easy to read, certainly sets him apart from his peers and the usurpers to follow. This effective passage, continuing the impact of Moore's magic on Faffrd, is a good example of his idiosyncrasies, with Leiber not content to just work with the words in the dictionary. The blackness all around him was a vast weight. He wondered if Moore had magicked him down into the ground beside his father. Yet it was a greater weight than that of 8 feet of frozen earth that pressed on him. It was the weight of the entire cold waste and its killingness, of the taboos and contempts and shut-mindedness of the Snow Clan. This example from the third story, Ilmeta Lankhmar, is doing something similar. This kind of hyphenation is very much a Leiberism, and they're dotted throughout the text. In this next example, though, we have all sorts of subject confusion, which I'm not going to read, I'll just point it out. But who is it that is ready to make the short chops? Yeah, it's fairly obvious that it's Hringle, but still, tidy prose might not begin a sentence with a pronoun substituting for a proper noun, and then use that as a subject, only to immediately switch subjects to a different one. Is this on screen now significantly less effective? Not really, it's just a little bit clearer. But if clarity of writing was Leiber's only goal, we wouldn't see passages like these, which are going to go across your screen quite quickly. I'm not going to read them because they're all really long sentences. By all means, abuse your pause button if you wish, but those are just a few examples of some staggeringly long sentences, and this is an idiosyncrasy purely of style, because you can see from the 4 examples, one of which contains actually 2 long sentences, they're all put to different ends. You might expect Fafford's drunken rambling to manifest in exactly this way, but this Lovecraftian effort is again creepy and unnatural. While this example, with its heavy polysyndeton, is an action sequence with our dashing duo fleeing for their lives. While usually still effective, you can see from this example, it's so long it requires repetition of the verb converging to not lose all of its meaning. Despite the fact it's clearly not always successful, it would be hard as an editor to argue that they should be restructured or fixed, because it's clearly a part of Leiber's personal style, part of what makes him a highly distinct artist. And if you haven't broken your pause button by now, though, you will see that there are occasions where it is effective and those where perhaps it isn't. It is, however, undeniably striking and unique. Perhaps Leiber hadn't developed this style so distinctly in the 1960s, or perhaps the movie just moved along more briskly, but I didn't notice it so much in the Unholy Grail, Sword and Deviltry's second story, which, even though it's the earliest written of the 3, is probably the best here. The Mouser is slightly more relatable than Faffrd. He's driven to vengeance by murder and betrayal. Here the darkness has taken up another notch, and his ultimate revenge is well developed and executed, particularly for such a short tale. The quality doesn't dip here. Certainly this passage from a longer section detailing the Mouser's darkfall is really strong, with some very striking, almost alliterative, sibilant reverse rhymes in the second half. This section is good enough to make you wish that Leiber was around to help writing with a similar fall from grace. The humour here is lessened, but when Leiber lightens things up somewhat, the balance just feels a little bit better. The Duke tore off the wing of a fowl and gnawed at it hungrily, but the next moment he gave a sudden cry of pain, louder than the first, staggered to his feet, clawed convulsively at his chest, and then pitched over the table where he lay groaning and writhing in his pain. "The Duke is stricken," the thin-faced henchman announced quite unnecessarily, and yet most portentously after bending over him. As you might expect, as the son of an actor and an actor himself, Leiber seems to have a pretty good eye for character, and that is true throughout, with Faffrd and the Grey Mouser individually behaving in ways that are true to their motivation and the environment, but it is also true of them when they're united in the third act. It makes the Grey Mouser's flirtation with black magic all the more interesting. It would have been interesting if Leiber had written this to be a more cohesive story rather than 3 separate ones, in that it might have developed better across the entirety of a novel. As it is, the second tale was my favourite one. The third tale is probably the weakest, but not by much, and it certainly isn't poor, because the mutual admiration and riffing off each other that develops between Faffrd and the Grey Mouser certainly shows the strength of them as a duo. And simple moments such as when they both share disguises and accoutrements and see each other as they actually are for the first time, slender and youthful, these really human moments, as you would probably expect by now, are deftly handled. The feeling each had of having turned boy all at once made their smiles for the first time a bit embarrassed. The main weakness here, though, is that the story takes too long to get going and then rushes through Faffrd and the Grey Mouser, scouting out the Beggars' Guild, and then immediately returning to it to defeat their foe. As with the Unholy Grail, the dark spell that is cast on our heroes is genuinely grim, but that our heroes fail to see the danger is perhaps a little weak, although you could argue that they were intoxicated at the time. They certainly sober up enough for a very swift, perhaps too swift resolution. Here the tone is again perhaps not quite right. The joviality in the drunken bonding between our heroes, the odd line like this one where the Grey Mouser lays stolen gems in the lap of Ivrian and the narrator tells us they gleamed in their new enviable location. And here where Leiber indulges in some of the wordplay he enjoys so much. It perhaps sits slightly awkwardly with the darkness of two women being eaten alive by rats. The final duel, though, is hard to dislike, rather like the whole book, really. Swords and Deviltry is 3 solid shorts. Oddly though, Faffrd and the Grey Mouser work well as a duo. It's their 2 origin stories where they work alone that shine the brightest here. It might have been an interesting novel if Leiber or his publishers or even editors had woven those distinctly separate shorts into a more cohesive singular story, but that's purely theoretical because they didn't. Leiber's idiosyncrasies as an author make this occasionally harder to read than it needs to be, but at the same time create a narrative voice that is both striking and effective. And these stories will have you smiling at the humour and generally drawn in by a trio of bustling and busy tales. Significantly, the characters drive those stories, and it isn't just the 2 leads that rings true, but rather also what would constitute the supporting cast. And with such a strongly human core, with such a vibrant voice, it's easy to see why this series attracted the fans that it did. It's hard not to recommend this book, and I think that fans of Gary Gygax will probably get a thrill out of reading the text that inspired so much of the Dungeons & Dragons world. Fans of later writers like Michael Moorcock and probably even Terry Pratchett will also find something to enjoy here. Swords and Deviltry gets the thumbs up, and if the third and final tale had been as brilliantly entertaining as the first 2, it probably would have got both. So thank you for watching all the way to the end. This is your last opportunity to like, subscribe and ring that bell, and if you do all of that, I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.